And now I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Demystifying Agile, DevOps, Traditional Project Management, and Six Sigma for Leaders. In just a moment, I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter today, Pete O'Donnell. Pete brings over 30 years of real-world IT and business management experience to the classroom. And as a technical instructor, he consistently works to expand his knowledge while building upon his varied and extensive certifications and experience. Pete has delivered agile, business analysis, and project management training for such clients as General Motors, Chrysler, CSC, Focus Bands, Jaguar Land Rover, the state of Maine, and the state of Massachusetts. We're very lucky to have him here today. Pete, you now have the floor.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. I have been really looking forward to November because it's project management month for some of you that may or may not realize that, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of bring you different perspectives on different life cycles and how we might go about doing that. As Mike told you, I have a pretty extensive background, anything from a developer and help desk person to CIO and everything in between. And it's a pleasure every time I get excited when I get to see and work with different people, whether it's a consulting role or a coaching role or just a plain lecture teaching role on how to make things better in their organization, whether it's at a business level or an IT level. Little fun fact about me, I've got this, and I was mentioning it to Mike. I actually coach high school football as well. I've had success, actually down to the final 8. Just finished up last week with a district championship, working on a regional championship this Friday. So those are some kind of current photos from that as well. And one of the reasons I kind of included that is I like to include some of the things that I take from a traditional project management approach and even apply it in real world situations that aren't necessarily project management related, right? But running a team, how are you going to go about doing that? Some of those things, how do we become more efficient? How do we become more effective? Some of those are things that frankly apply, whether they're business related stuff or things we have around the house or in this case, a football situation. So I do like to kind of include those things and kind of have those ideas as we move forward. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I included it. So our topics for today, right, what we're going to walk us through here for the next few minutes and stuff is really to kind of make sure that we understand the differences at a high level, right? Because this is more of a leadership perspective on it, of the different life cycles that exist and how we would go about using them and everything that goes into that, so that we have an understanding when it might be appropriate to use one over the other, when determining what those factors are that might influence us to pick one over the other, and then talk about some of the leadership things and challenges we have into that. And I've kind of got at the end some of the modern challenges and some of the ways we run traditional projects, and even whether it's a Six Sigma or whatever that approach that we're using today or some hybrid, that challenges that we face today and how we might want to start to think about reinventing that and re-going through that process so we're in a good place in terms of that. And that's what we'll focus on towards the end of that after we've kind of gone through the different life cycles. So we're going to start with the basics, and I put these in a particular order. The order was really to take us through what probably most of us are commonly using today, right? The traditional waterfall predictive project management that we get from the Project Management Institute and some of the things associated with that. We'll talk about that just in case we don't have the background. You're probably using it today, whether you realize it or not. We'll talk about Lean Six Sigma and what that brings to the table and some of the things that go into the mix in terms of that. We'll also talk about Agile, and there are lots of versions of Agile. We'll focus on the most popular briefly. We'll talk about Scrum and some of the things that go into that so we can kind of understand what that means and why a lot of organizations are moving towards that approach. And then we'll finish up with DevOps, which I like to kind of say is an extension of Agile. It's sort of a natural progression that a lot of organizations go through in terms of development from a organization that's transitioning from a traditional approach to an Agile approach and so on. And so that's kind of the approach we'll take as we move forward with some of these things. And I've just grabbed stuff from different places, different sources, and try to pull this together. There are always variations on this stuff as we progress, but let's start with the traditional project management approach, right? This is what we're probably most familiar with and most comfortable with. I don't care whether you've been formally trained or not. This is where we sort of default to in most organizations, right? It's a very linear approach. We do a lot of upfront planning. It's very heavy in terms of upfront planning because we're trying to get ourselves to a place where we have things really well defined, and a lot of times we'll look to seek signatures and approvals to create what we call baselines so that we have good set of requirements and we're locked in on exactly what we need and we're in a good place in terms of that, right? And that's our goal there. Again, this has been around forever, right? Since 1969, PMI's defined it. And there's a stat, and this was, when I pulled that out, I think it was from 2018, roughly 51% of organizations are still leveraging and using waterfall and predictive today. To be honest with you, it was a little lower than I thought it would be. I think a lot of us are doing hybrid, right, where we have some combination of things, and that's okay. And before we get too far into a lot of these life cycles, I think it's worth noting that I don't ever promote that an organization abandon one life cycle for another, right? I think there's going to be times and places where certain life cycles will fit better than others. And so I don't have a lot of organizations that I do on-site visits with or consulting or things that sort of go all in on one or all in on the other, or it's more of a sort of a in-between situation. The book defines things a certain way. PMI has a very detailed process on how we go about a waterfall approach, and the reality is we don't always follow that to the T. I mean, right, we have and I've got my older version of the PMBOK here, but this book is 750 pages of wonderfulness from PMI, really defines things very specifically for us, but it isn't always the way we're going to follow things. We're not always that formal and rigid. But the reason it's called waterfall and predictive is because it has this very linear pattern. And obviously, as you can see from this diagram, there are stages, and as we kind of fall onto each other, it has that waterfall cascading type approach, right? And so they talk about, defining things up front, doing requirements, design work, feasibility, spending a lot of time doing planning, right? And I always say plans are like rule books. It's about how we're going to go about being consistent with the way we approach stuff. And then eventually, finally, once we get some sort of approval and sort of agreement that, hey, we're good, we then go ahead and build the process. We go through whatever we're building, whether it's software, whether it's the latest and greatest widget or pen or whatever it is our product is. We build it, we test it, and then eventually we hand it off to the customer. Great traditional predictive approach, all very used to it, right? And PMI kind of breaks it up into these 5 main groups and these what they call process groups. We have an initiation part, we have a planning part, we have an executing part, we have a monitoring, controlling, and then we have a closing process group. And all of those things and all the techniques, and there's tons of techniques and tools and stuff we apply to doing that. And that's when we go and get trained from PMI or somebody like that on how to become a PMP, how to become a project manager and manage things. That's really about understanding the tools and techniques to apply that, right? So when does it make sense to use this and when doesn't it? Let's talk about that. As I told you, the pros are heavy upfront plan. It means everybody gets on the same page to start with. You get what the plan states, no surprise, right? Because frankly, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We are trying to get everybody in agreement. Now, sometimes easier said than done, right? And I teach lots of business analysis classes, and we spend lots of time talking about collecting requirements, the elicitation process of going through that and gathering that information. And certainly New Horizons has tons of classes around both business analysis and project management to kind of get you to that place. But it really comes down to getting it right, getting it locked in, getting that approval so that we can then move forward, right? And then time management and budget and cost control are big staples of project management and traditional project management, right? When we have strict budgets, we have due dates that are really strict and they have to be enforced, and we have to really manage to those. This is where traditional project management does a really good job. It also does a good job of managing risk, and I've got that as a when to use kind of thing coming up here as well. But budget obviously being a core of a lot of things we do. I mean, I think it's safe to say that most of us run our project with budgets. And certainly, you know, that design and all those things that we might have to sort through up front can be handled and addressed early on in the process. So that means if there's unknowns in traditional project management, we're going to spend a bunch of time trying to define those things, right? Even if that means I have to take weeks, days, months, whatever to kind of get that stuff clear, that's our goal. That's our focus. That's what we're trying to get to, right? And our testing, it becomes an emphasis of that, because now we've done so much upfront effort and we've done such detailed requirements gathering, we now can say, okay, let's go ahead, let's gear everything around this idea and this concept of here's my requirements, here's what I was approved on. So now I'm going to go build against that, and then I want to test against that. And that's ultimately our goal of what we're trying to do in traditional project management, right? Now, what's the downside? Because there's always downsides, right? Well, there is heavy upfront planning. To me, while that's a pro in one sense, it also is a con in another sense, right? Because if I have things that are not well defined, if I have things that are not going to lend themselves well to getting a lot of that upfront planning, or if I have an organization or a customer, whether the customer is internal or external, that just can't really get things designed and planned and thought through, this can be very detrimental to this predictive approach, right? Because we are trying to lock things in. We are trying to get things. So when we have lots of unknowns, that becomes a problem. Difficult to find projects, difficult to find customers that are unwilling participants, also a problem, right? Because I've got to gather this information from them, and if they're not willing to participate, we're going to have a problem with that along the way. Lack of flexibility to change things along the process. So we spent a bunch of time trying to lock things in, right? Again, we're very linear in our approach. When we're trying to lock things in, the goal is to try to get it right up front. And that means that what happens when I do have changes that come in from the side, or things are unexpected from whether it's top down or the bottom up, right? That can be very disruptive to our waterfall approach, right? And that's where that problematic, not that there's not a change control mechanism and something in there to accommodate it, but in certain situations, it can be very disruptive to the point where our project almost hits a wall and it comes to a stop. We want to get to a place where we have that consistency and we can kind of accommodate change. We're going to have to look at something else, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then longer time to deliver value to our customers. What do I mean by that? Well, yeah, I can break, and I'm going to go back to the timeline here. If you look at this, right, I don't really get value or the deliverable or anything realized to my customers until the very end. Now, can I break this up into different phases and approaches? Absolutely, right? But the reality is it's still a longer life cycle. We're going to be talking about Agile, where I might be delivering things as short as 2 weeks, or DevOps, where it might be continuous deployment and I'm delivering it as soon as I'm done. Those are items that are ultimately a much quicker deliverable in the hands of the customer sooner approach. So again, in traditional project management, we tend to make the customer wait. And hopefully, and this is the big one, right, that we didn't miss the mark, that we define things correctly to begin with, right? Because if something was off, or we misunderstood, or we missed talking to somebody, then that value may not be fully realized. We may have missed the mark in terms of what we're trying to deliver to our customers, and ultimately we'll have failure when it comes to that. So I kind of put together a when to use kind of guidelines when it comes to this. Again, budgets, timelines are constraints to the success. I think traditional project management is a key ingredient to that. That doesn't mean that, yeah, I can't manage to a budget or a timeline in some of these other approaches, because I certainly can. But this is where it really is good, right? Our project managers are rock stars when it comes to this, when they've been formally trained and they know how to go through that process, right? And again, when the deliverable is well defined up front, so I can really capture what value is, I can really show what's going to be going on. And again, we need to consistently deliver or repeat the delivery of the same product over time. So again, if I'm producing, and again, this doesn't have to be software, this could be anything, right? I'm building a apartment complex. Well, I don't want variance between one apartment building to the next, right? I want that consistency. Traditional project management works excellent for that, right? We define exactly what we want, we build it, we build it again, we build it again, we build it again, right? We're going to get that consistency along the way. And there's not likely to be a lot of change. So things that don't change dramatically certainly are great candidates for that. And the last one, when we need to manage lots of risk, right? What do I mean by that? Well, risk is one of those things that we always have to factor. I don't care what life cycle we're going to pick, risk is always going to be an influencer. However, if I'm launching somebody into space like SpaceX, right, I have a different level of risk than if I'm designing a piece of software to be used internally, right? Different spectrums of level of risk. Can I get away with not a lot of heavy planning in launching people into space? Probably not. I'm not the one that's going to sign up to ride on that rocket if that's the case. But certainly in a case where I'm, producing something internal, it's not a lot of brand damage, there's not a loss of life potential, right? Risk becomes something where we really can influence which life cycle based on that as well. And we'll talk about that as we get into some of these other ones. So when we're heavy on the risk side, a lot of times budget, timelines, those kinds of factors, things are well defined, all that good stuff up front. We're in a really good place when it comes to traditional project management. And again, 51% of the organizations are using some version of that today. And again, I think if you had looked even 10 years ago, that would have been a bigger number. But we are seeing a progression to other things, and we're going to talk about some of those others as we move forward. So that's the traditional approach. Let's talk about Six Sigma. And I put lean in here for a reason. Okay, so Six Sigma stands by itself. But lean is a concept that frankly is going to be introduced both in Six Sigma, it's going to be introduced in Agile, and it's certainly going to be introduced in DevOps. And we'll talk about sort of what that is and what those things mean as we progress. But lean and Six Sigma really go hand in hand. That's why I included them here. Six Sigma is really about process improvement, elimination of waste, elimination of defects, and it's very data driven, right? We're going to use statistics to look to minimize the amount of defects or errors or mistakes or waste that comes from a process while maximizing the value to our end user, to our business, to our customers. Again, this can be used in a business world. It can be used in the manufacturing. In fact, its roots really come from the manufacturing world. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Lean is another concept. And again, when we talk about lean project management, it's really about elimination of waste. How do I maximize the value while minimizing the waste? That's my goal here as I try to progress and ultimately what we're trying to get to. So as we move forward with this, again, it came back early, 1980s, Six Sigma really started to get its traction. General Electric in the 1990s really sort of was the catalyst to sort of get this to be really kind of a gear in everybody's process, because they were saying, hey, look, we're going to not only, we're going to incorporate this, but we're going to start gearing our compensation based on Six Sigma implementation and the reduction of waste and the reduction of some things like, defects and some of the things that go into that, right? Those are things we want to move and get away from. Again, lean comes from manufacturing as well. Toyota Production Systems, or TPS as you probably referred, 60s, late 50s, 60s, they're really kind of in there, where again, Japan really kind of leverage and try to say, what things can we do to really sort of eliminate waste? Well, the reality is some of these concepts go all the way back to Henry Ford and Boeing and some of these things in the early 1900s, right? The assembly line, the first assembly line done by Henry Ford and some of the things associated with that. Those things are big dynamic things that really sort of, again, what are they? Just taking a look at a process and how do I improve it? How do I get myself to a place where I'm now being consistent with things as I move forward? That's our goal, and that's ultimately where lean really complements Six Sigma, because Six Sigma is about waste reduction, right? Six Sigma is about defects being eliminated. It's about efficiencies in our process. It's about improving that process. Guess what? Lean has the same concepts. So like I said, we teach these usually hand in hand. All the classes that I instruct and when I go on site and do consulting different pieces, Lean and Six Sigma go hand in hand. Now, I have done Lean by itself because oftentimes we can apply Lean in other ways when Six Sigma isn't really a desired piece, and we'll talk about sort of pros and cons of that here in a minute. So there's a life cycle for this as well, right? We call it the diamaic approach. The diamaic roadmap is essentially what the life cycle will look like in a Six Sigma world. Again, we have a define phase, right? We have a measure phase, we have an analyze phase, we have an improve phase, and we have a control phase. So again, we have similar kinds of groupings to what we talked about. Now, Six Sigma is very data-driven. So we spend a lot of time, like we should in any good project, defining the problem and objective in the define phase. But the M is where it gets unique to Six Sigma. This is where we have to figure out what are we going to measure, right? And what is the significance of the measurement systems? Are they contributing in a negative way, a positive way to what we're trying to get to here? We got to make sure that we have a good understanding of those things. Got to make sure that we can improve on things. Well, again, we got to figure out what we got to measure to begin with, right? What are indicators? What are the key inputs that can affect the output? Well, I've got to know what those inputs are that are going to affect the output. I got to figure what those things are. And that's where we get into analyze phase, where we start to look at all the things we measure and figure out what are those factors of influence, as they say, right? If I adjust this input, what does the effect have on my process? Well, again, is it going to improve it? Great. We're going to use statistics to kind of determine that. It is a very data statistical driven approach, okay? Because it has to have data to look for patterns, to look for tendencies, right? To look for inferences of where we want to go. And so by analyzing that information and using this as part of our project management approach, we can gain insight into how do we going to improve things, right? And then ultimately, obviously, improve is, okay, now we've identified those key inputs, those key factors that might influence the difference. What are the changes we want to make, right? If my goal is to improve a process by X percentage or to eliminate defects by Y amount, right? I'm going to try to improve that process to get myself to that place. That's our goal. And so the improve phase is obviously the key piece. And then we go ahead, we implement those improvements. And then the last piece is that idea that if I'm going to make a change, I don't know about you, but I don't like to make changes and then have them go off track, right? I want things to be sustained. I want to have that sustained, consistent approach. And that's what the control phase is. The control phase says, hey, look at that control process. We want to make sure that we have good thresholds in place. I understand, what's in control, what's out of control. When I start to see a trend in a bad way, I want to be able to make sure I can make adjustments and move forward. And so that's where that control piece comes in the mix. And again, here's those listed here. Lean Sigma Corporation is the organization that New Horizons uses to certify whether you want to become a green belt, a black belt, or a yellow belt, which is more of the management level. I didn't include all of those different levels, but there's programs for each one of those so that you can figure out where you want to go as an organization. Yellow belt's really sort of that more introductory. We're not going to get heavy into the statistics side of it. Green belt's where we start to bring in the statistics part of it. So the analyze phase is really a big proponent, and a black belt is really sort of the master. You can run multiple projects and things associated with it. So there's just levels of progression, just like we have in the martial arts and the belts. The same thing is kind of set up in the Six Sigma world for the progression of your growth within the life cycle itself. And so what are the pros? Well, the nice part is I'm using data and statistics to determine what's actually going on. I'm not guessing. I'm like, oh, it's like being blindfolded and throwing darts at a wall. I'm not doing that. I'm actually using data and statistics to try to draw those conclusions to help me out. Now, again, can data lie? Can I misunderstand? Can I misinterpret? Sure, that's part of what that becoming, more the green belt and then eventually the black belt that helps you so you can be, so we're not misinterpreting or misunderstanding things. It does increase our communication collaboration, right? Because we're listening to everybody that's part of the process. Again, if I have multiple stages of a process, I've got to examine each piece of that, right? I've got to be able to collect information of that. So I have to give voice to all those people and be able to hear their concerns and everything that goes with that. And ultimately, it's about improving quality and customer satisfaction, right? The quality is our goal. Six Sigma and Lean, it's about elimination waste and increasing quality, increasing value. So certainly, hopefully, we're going to get more satisfied customers as opposed to somebody who may get a brand new pen in their box and it's defective, right? It doesn't work or it's broken or something like that. Or a piece of software that's not doing, it's not producing the results that we want. Or a process, whether it's manufactured or otherwise, that's not performing as we desire. And so ultimately, it drives around that quality piece and hopefully reduce our costs around poor quality. Again, that doesn't mean we're going to not have to spend and invest money in quality measures, but it ultimately is going to help us on the backside from all the defects and defective products and rework and all the the waste that ends up coming up if we're not really efficient with our quality. And again, better productivity and time management because there's a process to it, right? If I'm saying, if I don't have Six Sigma and I'm just going to examine a process, oftentimes it gets us to a place where we're just like, well, let's, hey, go look at this process, go look at this step, go look at this step. But collectively, we don't really do the examination that we need to. And this is where it's going to put us in a much better place in terms of that. Okay. And so cons. Well, it does require a detailed understanding of the process. Now, I'm going to argue if you come take a BA class with me, a business analysis class, anyways, this should never ever be facilitated to change no matter what life cycle you use without understanding what's going on today. But it's amazing how often organizations will undertake a change without really having a good understanding of the process. Six Sigma is going to require detailed understanding, right? Again, can be expensive. Data collection is at a high cost. So if I need data to draw conclusions and data is costly to capture, then that can be a problem, right? For example, automotive world, right? If I'm doing crash testing of cars, safety ratings and different things, or I'm trying to test the quality of a new part, right? And I actually have to crash a vehicle, that comes at a pretty high cost. I don't get to just crash a car every 10 minutes just because I need to. That it does come at a cost. So sometimes data collection can be very expensive. And even in a software world, right? I got to store data somewhere, right? So storage and some of the things that go into that comes at a cost as well. Collection can be time consuming or difficult for some process. Again, I just gave you an example of one. And that certainly can be something that a lot of times businesses don't get their hands around very well, right? They don't get their hands around the idea that, hey, we've got to collect this stuff and we've got to do it in a way that's not disruptive to the process as well. And then focus can be narrow and not consider the bigger picture. So one of the things that I often find sometimes people put their blinders on when it comes to a specific process, but they don't look at how that process fits into the organization as a whole, right? Again, one of the things that I'm a big proponent of, and I don't care which life cycle you pick, you have to align to certain things, right? I have to align to my goal, my mission for my organization, my long-term goals and objectives, my strategic plan, where am I going? Oftentimes Six Sigma tends to lock us in on a specific process and everything associated with that, and that becomes a problem. So when do we use it? Well, certainly anytime I need to eliminate waste, right? Whether it's waste of time, materials, or other resources. If we got defects, if I'm producing something that's defective, even if it's at a software level, right? Or I'm getting lots of variations, right? This is, these are both supposed to be red, right? That's a variation. That's a problem. So I've got to figure out what's causing those problems. So this really focuses that again. Again, like I said, it puts the blinders on, but it does allow us to focus on the problem. It allows us to use data effectively to increase efficiency and productivity. When I'm data driven and I have lots of data already, this is a no-brainer, right? And then ultimately, yes, like anything, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and whether we're designing a new process or redesigning an effective one, this can be very powerful. And there are hybrids of this, right? Lean Six Sigma is a very basic approach to things. with lots of details around the statistical sampling and how we're going to go through all of that process. But we can take a hybrid agile approach to even how we go about that. And again, we talk about some of that stuff as we move forward. Right? And then agile. Right? Agile is the one that's probably grown the most. Agile is probably the one that, as a leader in your organization or somebody who's trying to facilitate transformation in your organization, Agile is probably the first thing that pops up. Why? Because we always hear about things, key ingredients. Agile is an iterative and incremental approach, right? We work in small batches, right? We visualize things, everything's transparent, everybody can see anything and everything, right? We collaborate and work with the customer on a daily basis, or at least somebody that represents the customer, and we are giving them an opportunity to give us feedback. But here's the word that we most commonly hear, right? It's change friendly. Agile is change friendly. The process itself accommodates change. So when I want to have something that I don't have well defined, Agile usually comes to the forefront. So a little history on Agile, right? And again, there's some variations on this, kind of where it varies, but sort of early 2000, group of people met together to start to talk about how we could go about improving things and bringing things quicker to market, right? They had two things they realized: shortening the delay of the benefits of the user in order to resolve the product market fit and development graveyard problems, and getting feedback from users quickly to confirm the usefulness of new software and continue to improve on it accordingly. So those are the two emphases. They came back in roughly about a year later, and they developed something that became known as the Agile Manifesto. Okay? And at that moment, what that is it's essentially a moment where we have what I like to call the groundwork or the level setting of all types of Agile. One of the things, for those of you that are not familiar with Agile, there are lots of versions of Agile. For example, Scrum, because most commonly people hear Scrum Master, things like Scrum is by far the most popular version. One of the reasons it's so popular is because it's simple, very basic, okay? But there are all sorts of different versions of Agile that exist. Crystal, Extreme Program, Kanban, all sorts of extensive frameworks that will scale to larger organizations. Things like SAFe, or produced by Scaled Agile. That takes sort of all of this stuff and puts it on steroids and says, here's how we can manage things at a global enterprise portfolio level and how I can run Agile in that mix. So again, it started small and simple. It's grown from there. The manifesto, and I tell all my students, if I'm teaching in an Agile class and their goal is to take some sort of exam, you should know the manifesto. In fact, I have it popped up here. The manifesto is really this idea and concept that we have some core principles and values. That's what those things are listed here. These are our primary and secondary values. And these are, if you look at them, you can kind of tell the difference here. Individual interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan, right? It's a different mindset. No, this doesn't get you out of jail with not doing documentation. Obviously, audit, compliance, all those things still have to be adhered to. But it gives the groundwork, and in fact, there's what are called 12 principles here. You can see, if you click this link here, it'll actually outline, again, the mindset. And I always say, once we go down the Agile path or the DevOps path, which is kind of progression of Agile, we have a mindset cultural change here that's kind of going in the mix. Not all organizations are going to be able to do this like that. A lot of organizations are going to have to be challenged in different ways to get ourselves to a better place. But Agile and this manifesto really gives us the mindset that we need moving forward so we can be successful. And so I took, and again, we don't have time today to go through in this quick webinar of this entire process of exactly what Agile is. But I think one of the key things is for us to kind of understand, and this is Scrum, to be clear. And again, most popular and most of the certifications that you see out there, and including the Scrum study, which is what New Horizons uses, but PMI also available, some other variations. All of them really kind of start with Scrum as the core, because if you kind of understand the core concepts of it, you're in a better place. I always tell my students here, like this whole business plan, project business case, the vision statement, that's like your initiation in any project. Again, I've got to have a clear expectation of what we're trying to do in traditional project management. That doesn't change here, right? But what happens is, what's different is this prioritized product backlog, right? When we are trying to change things, it's as simple as matter of changing the priorities in this product backlog, and that changes what we work on. This is our master list of requirements, so to speak, right? And how we slice and dice that, and we can get into what's called a release planning, which is kind of like a scoping document. Keep it simple, so I'm going to leave it at that. But our idea behind this is, as we move items from our product backlog to what we call our sprint backlog, that is a commitment from the team to say, hey, these are the items we're going to work on for the next 2 weeks. And again, they've got a range here. It says 1 to 6 weeks. 2 weeks is the most common. 3 weeks in a lot of organizations, 2 or 3 weeks are the most common. But it's going to be consistent. So every 2 weeks, we're doing a sprint. And every 2 weeks, we're working on and delivering an increment. Yeah, I'm not able to do a full product in 2 weeks, right? But in that increment, I have to meet what we call the definition of done. And what that does is it defines what state the deliverable has to be in. So if I say to a business, and again, this is very commonly used in software world, although I did a training for the state of Massachusetts on reviewing policies and laws within their the state, they actually used an agile approach to that. And what they did is every 2 weeks, they would visit a different section of that, and they would go through that, and they would look for changes. And they defined their definition of done is they were reviewed, and all suggested changes were proposed. In software, it might mean that I'm through user acceptance testing, right? But that full life cycle actually happens in the context of the sprint itself. So that means in that 2 weeks, if it is, we're going to meet every day. We're going to do check-ins with the team. They're going to give us updates on how they're doing on their tasks. Anybody's welcome. All of this stuff is transparent. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we're going to do what's called a review meeting, where we demonstrate our deliverable, assuming we met the definition done, and we do a retrospective where we reflect on how we can get better. And that's this process. Now, again, lots of details here, lots of the devil's in the details associated with that. But that process just repeats itself over and over and over again. And again, if the business suddenly wants to change its priorities, they just change and reorganize that prioritized product backlog to reflect what changes they want. So this is when we say it's change friendly. It is change friendly, right? Because the business, all they have to do is change the order of that backlog, and away we go. Now, the extensive upfront planning that we had in the traditional project management and all that stuff, it's kind of out the window. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do, in certain cases, architectural sprints and things to kind of lay out some of that stuff. It absolutely happens in the real world. But instead of kind of trying to get everything just right and sort of locking everybody in on things from a mindset standpoint and getting signatures, what we're doing in Agile is we're saying, hey, based on at this point in time, based on what I know at this point, here's what I'm going to decide with. Here's what I'm going to move forward with. And that's how they're going to move forward. And that's how we progress in Agile. And again, there's Scrum Study, which is, again, the organization that New Horizons does for their certifications. They, again, have 5 process groups, right? Or they call them phase groups, but initiation, plan and estimate, implement, review, retrospective, and the release. So again, you start to see a theme here. These are all very similar in their approach, right? Even though they may have different ways about going about it. So why would I go with Agile? Well, again, it gives our designers the freedom to develop. We don't lock them in on exact stuff. We empower and trust the team to do what's best. And that's the idea behind it, right? We make the development process more adaptable. Feedback and testing occurs simultaneously. So inside that sprint, we're always constantly working together as a team and sort of getting that information and trying to get feedback. At the end of 2 weeks, we're literally going to hopefully have somebody on the business side say, hey, this is good, or they're going to say no, or it's good, and here's some additional changes I'd like. All that stuff goes back to that product backlog. All right. And again, the ideas works with ideas that are not well defined or have end goals. What do I mean by that? Well, again, if you have a lot of unknowns, you have customers or your business, or your end users that are asking for this stuff don't really know what they want, this is where it gets us, right? Agile is a great approach for that. I can start the process and I can learn as I go. I can, again, based on this point in time, I know what I know and I'm going to move forward. Now, the flip side, con side of it, right? We got to merge these increments together at some point. So sometimes certain products that can be more difficult than others. Some products lend themselves nicely to this. And again, we can do those releases. If you remember, I said, hey, that scoping thing. Sometimes we can bundle sprints together to actually add value. Again, there's no well-defined plan or heavy upfront plan. So some might argue that's a pro. I might, but it's also a con in some organizations, right? If you're, and you guys as leaders, if you're expecting your business and your teams to produce all those traditional project predictive waterfall deliverables, Agile doesn't have those, right? So that becomes very cultural problematic. Collaboration must happen for it to be successful. Absolutely. The manifesto actually tells us we should be face-to-face. It promotes co-location. Now, obviously, with the pandemic and everything associated with that, we've learned how to do that remotely. But one of the things I do in those cases is I make my my Agile teams. I got one week from Friday I'm meeting with, kind of see where they've done based on my coaching. Cameras on. I'm like, yeah, got to have cameras on, right? Because the accountability comes from that. And then, yeah, it's sensitive to time boxes and resource allocation. So Scrum especially, everything's fixed amount of time. Like if we go back to that timeline here, right? The sprint planning meeting for a 2-week sprint is 4 hours or less. The release planning is 8 hours. The daily stand-up meeting is 15 minutes every day. The review meeting is 2 hours or less for a 2-week sprint. The retrospective is 2 hours less if you start violating these time boxes or running long in these meetings, this process can fall apart. They prefer to also have dedicated team members, not always possible, right? Real world is that doesn't happen, but I got to have dedicated time to it. So I always tell people, like, it's not, when I hear people are like, oh, I'm on 5 Agile projects. Like, well, then you're not doing Agile even close to the way it's defined, because it would be impossible for you to pull that off from a resource standpoint. You just wouldn't have time to get stuff done. All right, so when to use it? When you need to get value in the hands of our customers, work on deliverables that are ever changing, and we need to react to change quickly. Again, projects where things are not well defined up front, customers don't know what they want, but you have a high trust environment. Agile is your fit. So last piece here that I have from a life cycle to discuss is DevOps. And as I mentioned to you earlier, to me, DevOps is a progression of Agile. What has happened in the real world is as organizations have gotten really good with Agile, their ability to roll those changes out into their live production environment became a problem because their operation people were putting up that wall. They're putting up a barrier because we didn't think about things like governance, risk, compliance, security, operational stuff when we were doing Agile. So what DevOps is, as they said, is it's about bringing all of that stuff together. Okay? Again, practice of operations development, engineers participating together. That's really what it is. And I always like to say it's an extension of that. Again, it comes back from 2009. Patrick Dubois was one of the first people to kind of coin this term. And I love this last statement. Not only DevOps isn't a process or technology standard, many devotees refer to it as a culture. And I think that's true because in order to pull this off, it requires significant cultural changes within an organization. Agile required some, DevOps requires even more. Okay, and what we're doing is we're bringing people together. Again, we use DevOps Institute, which is a certifying body, to train folks on all these different items. But it's a mixture of culture, key processes we have. Again, whether that's Agile, Lean, notice Lean mentioned ITSM, IT service management. So your folks that are on your operations side, that are ITIL certified and stuff. And the CI/CD, we'll talk about what that is here in a minute, but it's that continuous delivery, continuous integration, continuous deployment model. And yes, automation. You might have folks in your organization as leaders are coming to you like, hey, we got to do DevOps, we got to do DevOps, got to do DevOps. Again, if it's coming from the bottom up where it's your IT folks that are pushing it, unfortunately, a lot of times they only think about the automation piece first. Notice the size of these gears, they matter. The culture mindset is significantly different, and that's ultimately where we want to go with this. And so let's talk about CD and continuous delivery and continuous deployment and the difference, because this is a term as a leader might get thrown at you. And I think it's important for us to kind of differentiate the difference on this. Yes, DevOps is always about trying to automate stuff. So it's about taking Agile, it's about taking our operations folks and bringing them together. In a continuous delivery model, which is this top model here, right? In the continuous delivery model, notice the little red arrow. There is somebody that has to push a button or some sort of process or script that is required before our changes get into our live production environment. That's continuous delivery. In a continuous deployment model, everything's automated. Amazon.com is an example of a continuous deployment model. Literally, they deploy changes thousands of times a day. If we were to all jump on Amazon.com right now, it's very likely that some of us are going to be working off different code bases than others, because they are literally deploying 1,000 times a day. Now, in order to be able to have that automation, are there lots of things that are going to be behind the scenes, and absolutely from automation and having the right ability to roll things back and architecture, 100%. There's a lot of devil in the details here, okay? But we have to understand that just DevOps doesn't require full automation, right? Continuous delivery is DevOps. But it's also about bringing lean concepts and improving and looking for efficiencies and how do we get better. And so the last, that CI definition that kind of mentioned here was on this diagram. CI refers to the idea that we are constantly trying to integrate, continuous integrate. So it requires our developers and people that are coding and stuff to check in code daily so that things are always in a potential releasable state. Could be deployed if we choose to, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so that's what DevOps really brings to the table here. Again, I always say it's kind of like Agile on steroids. Obviously, it's going to get things in our hands quicker. It's about trying to be more efficient because we're bringing automation, bringing the operation people in here. We're engaged, we're motivated because everybody's participating. I got a big list of pros here, right? Hopefully aligned to our vision, where we're trying to go, everything we're trying to do, better team efficiencies, everything we're trying to do from a cross-skilled standpoint. Now, flip side is, right, it does require a cultural mindset, right? It means you have to have people that normally are probably approving things, let that go, right? Now, does that mean that they still can't feel, they still have to sleep well at night, right? No, we look to automate that. We need to understand what they do to feel satisfied. Well, we got to build that into our automation process. Again, legacy systems can be problematic, it can still be done. Expertise. These people are in high demand, right? Because I'm basically trying to take somebody that's a developer, an operations person, and kind of bring them together from a mindset standpoint. And so the transition and the tools that go into this can get difficult and require additional complexities. And I will tell you this, for those that are, again, leading sort of this stuff, don't buy into the IT folks that are telling you have to buy stuff. Most of the tools nowadays can be integrated. Shouldn't be a tools first mentality, it has to be a top-down cultural mentality. And again, we've got lots of offerings around how we can do that. But again, the idea is to eliminate the knowledge transfer department because we're one group. We decentralize things, right? That Agile teams and processes throughout the entire life cycle. And again, operations no more just like the care and feeding, they're part of that process to begin with. Ultimately, it reduces our risk and it gives us a continuous improvement. Now, those are the four that we focused on. The last, and I just got a couple of slides here and then we'll finish up. From a leadership standpoint, a lot of times our traditional project management lead us to a lot of the problems we have today, right? Failure to communicate, accountability, fear of firing, lack of alignment. And we get this sort of command and control structure, right? Project managers, traditional project managers telling people what to do. We're micromanaging people. That's not where we want to go. As we move into an Agile world, as we move into a DevOps world, and even if we're doing traditional project management, the empowerment is the key, right? We want to eliminate silos, and we don't want silos within a silo. What do I mean by that? Well, again, a lot of us have departments oriented. Here's my development folks, here's my operations folks, here's my security folks, here's my compliance folks, right? But they don't really necessarily communicate. And that's the problem, right? Because no one team owns the outcome, and there's no alignment on all of those different groups and their goals. And so what do? Well, we got to facilitate meetings and different things and kind of manage that stuff, and it becomes very burdensome. Well, again, all of that stuff, the handoffs, the excessive meetings, you know, multiple team handoffs, they're all inefficiencies that we see in regardless of the life cycle we have. What we want is a modern team, right, that encourages collaboration. We do self-trust, we empower people, right? We start to do what we call cross-functionality, development of our teams, and try to optimize for the organization and to try to do the work. And we try to do that at all different levels. And the basic idea is, let's break down the silos, right? How do we get to a better place where we can gear and orient and get people to break these silos down so we're all in this together? And that's the idea of what we're trying to do here when it comes to leadership, regardless. But certainly, as you progress into an Agile or a DevOps world, those become key components to success. Organizations that empower the employees are the ones that are having success with DevOps. So that is kind of what I had from a conclusion standpoint, you know, to understand the difference and some of the challenge with it. Obviously, my recommendations when you're starting to figure out where you want to go, got to evaluate where you are today. Value stream maps can be very powerful to identify areas where you need to focus change, because it doesn't look at an individual process, but it looks at from the beginning to the end of an entire life cycle of whatever you're doing, the service, the request, the customer needs to the delivery of their hands, include suppliers, all that other stuff that goes into that. Once we've got that, we can determine our gaps and then figure out what skills and knowledge we need to develop to moving forward from there. And so obviously, New Horizons has tons of different classes around this. There's upcoming webinars, there's project management classes, whether it's Agile specific, Lean Six Sigma, traditional project management, DevOps, lots of different offerings and things that are there, and certainly look to fill any of those needs along the way. So with that, I don't know, Mike, if you guys have, if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pete. As you mentioned, if anybody has any questions, please do take a moment to type them into the questions box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can shortly. And if anyone is interested in the material presented in the webinar today, or if you have questions regarding available course offerings, please do contact your local New Horizons Center for further information. You can log on to newhorizons.com and do a zip code search or a region search and find the center nearest you. And our webinar schedule is also up to date on our website at newhorizons.com. Just click on the webinars link about halfway down the page, and you can view the full schedule and register for any upcoming sessions. And a friendly reminder, we will be sending out the recording link to today's webinar later today, and you can see the slide deck for download there on the right-hand side of your screen. So first question, Pete, are there any books that you recommend to help us get started?
Sure. So, you know, obviously in project management world, PMI, you know, becoming a member, obviously that's kind of their go-to thing. But I think and Six Sigma has standards as well that you can apply to, and we'll put together a list of links to some of these things. But there are some things that I think, regardless of whether you guys are traditional or not, the Phoenix Project is a great read. It takes and thinks about, it's fiction, but it takes an approach from a DevOps world and kind of how Agile and some of those things can kind of help us. The DevOps handbook is kind of the de facto guide that really kind of encompasses some of that. This also has something in here that we refer to as the 3 ways that are really kind of epitomize how we should empower and work with different people. The idea is the first wave is the way is normally left to right flow. Second way is now giving feedback. The third way is the one that most organizations require cultural changes, where we can encourage people to experiment, safe experimentation, but using that as an exercise to learn and grow as not only an organization, but the way we would go about doing things. Target, some of the other organizations are perfect examples of where they've taken DevOps transformations and saved huge amounts of monies, new efficiencies, and frankly have done lots of product development through using that third way. So again, the Phoenix project I think is a good read. Do highly recommend it. There's a Unicorn project, which is a follow-up to that as well. I don't have the official book on that because mine's on an e-reader. But then the DevOps handbook I think is also very powerful in terms of that.
Awesome. Are there reasons or any situations in which we might want to change our project management style mid-project, like move from waterfall to agile, for example?
That's a great question. I think again, I think you have to evaluate where you're at with what's going on, right? Certainly if we have something that was well defined and we started at a traditional approach and now suddenly it's really a lot of chaos is ensuing and it's not well defined and maybe we weren't as accurate as we thought, it might make sense to do that. I don't think in Agile, if I'm doing an Agile approach or something like that, if I have suddenly a lot of stuff that I need to plan, I can accommodate that in the framework, so I can do a hybrid of that. So I wouldn't necessarily abandon Agile for traditional. I would just probably run some of those sprints in a more traditional fashion if I needed to, where I'm doing more of that planning sprint and design sprint and some of those other things. That gives you the best of both worlds if that's the case where you kind of run into that. And then obviously if we're data driven, then we probably should have been Six Sigma to begin with. So DevOps is not something we do overnight, by the way. That requires some infrastructure and other stuff. It's a progression. So certainly that's not something we're going to change gears on. Great question.
How do I pull in or convince reluctant participants to follow DevOps practices?
So I think this is going to be the biggest part of that cultural change that we referred to, right? That if I have a business that is very set in its ways, you've got to try to figure out how to show them the value of when they participate, what that's doing, right? And I always, when I'm coaching folks that are transitioning to Agile, one of the things we talk about quite a bit is there is a point where you sort of get over the hump and the business starts to realize that, hey, I don't have to ask for everything under the sun anymore, because in every 2 weeks or whatever your duration is, I might be able to make a change, and I get it. So I don't have to worry about all that mindset of a business where we always had to feel like we had to put everything in, otherwise I wasn't going to get it. That cultural change is going to take time. Some of that will require you to kind of facilitate getting people to show up to these meetings and other things. And now, again, if I've got some top-down buy-in on that, usually we're in a much better place than if we're trying to do it from the bottom up. You know, the IT group, and again, my background is very heavy IT, but you know, it's more business the last 10 plus years. You know, the business buy-in has to be there as well to facilitate that cultural piece that comes into the mix.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. It looks like we're just about out of time, so I'll go ahead and conclude it. But thank you, Pete. We really appreciate it. It was really, really helpful, and the way you delved into all those different styles, I think is really beneficial to us, so we understand when to apply what and what the pros and cons were, especially. Thank you so much. That'll conclude the session today.
Thank you.